Hi, my name is Josh Brown and I teach Italian here at the Australian National University. My research looks at the history of Italian and in particular where Italian has come from and how it's evolved over many centuries. So we know a lot about the literary standard of Italian, which is based on Old Florentine and how it's evolved during the Renaissance and in the modern period to form the national standard, which is used in Italy today. But we don't know much about the other languages that Italian has come into contact with and what that can tell us about the really interesting linguistic dynamics behind the evolution of standard languages in language history. So my research is really looking at the history of multilingualism in Italy, the way that Italian reacts and evolves, even at the very grammatical interface between the standard language and non-standard languages, and why that's important in the history of Italian. One of the main pieces of research that I've just submitted is an edited volume called Languages of Renaissance Italy. So that book has 15 contributors from around the world that looks at how Italian has formed during the Renaissance, but also in contact with other languages, including Middle English, Arabic, languages from Ethiopia, languages in contact in Renaissance Italy, and also things like Sanskrit and how the numerical system that we call Arabic numerals came into existence in medieval and Renaissance Italy. These are kind of really important projects because oftentimes we're looking at ways of how language evolved that wasn't just literary language or kind of the most famous writers, the most famous poets in kind of Renaissance Italy. So a lot of times we know what that language looks like. We've got very detailed descriptions of the grammar behind the language, particular endings of verbs and nouns. But at the same time as that process was ongoing in Renaissance Italy, many other writers who've often been ignored throughout linguistic history were also engaged in forms of writing that just haven't been looked at. So they often include women writers, religious history, religious writers, for example, preachers, what we would call non-literary writing, basically. So they're the people who are just writing everyday language from that they would speak with their mums and dads or their friends. That's important because those kind of dynamics that people were writing at those stages can tell us a lot about how languages were evolving and kind of hide linguistic dynamics that haven't been explored in standard languages. Another project that I'm looking at involves how Italian is really a multilingual language from its origins. So another publication that should come out this year looks at a dictionary from 1830 that was published in Algiers. And people have called this a dictionary of lingua franca because Italian was used a lot as a trade language around the Mediterranean right from the 13th century up until the 19th century. But that means that Italian clashed, so to speak, with many other local and regional languages around the Mediterranean. And that kind of history about the multilingual nature in Italy's history just hasn't been told. And it can also tell us a lot about the fact that Italian wasn't just written as a literary language, but it's got implications for including marginalized groups in linguistic history. So I see it as a very important aspect, actually, of both linguistics and philology, linguistic history. So I'm really interested in this language because it really shows us how Italian came into contact with multiple people around the Mediterranean and how languages don't just belong to one particular ethnic group or one particular community. They're really agglomerations or they're used by multiple people. And it also gives us a much more realistic way of looking at the past because it means that we can see the past through a lens of multiplicities in a way. So we get an idea of a global Renaissance and a global Middle Ages. It's really important to show how languages don't just belong to one particular set of writers. They're not just literary writers. They're not just Florentine writers. Languages travel in many different ways. And so it's important for history to be able to show that things that we often think of as being homogeneous or just one single entity actually come from multiple different origins. By exploring those origins, we can get a real insight into important aspects of linguistic evolution in language history. Hi, I'm Josh Brown and I teach Italian here at the Australian National University. My research really looks at the emerging standard of Italian, and that's a research agenda that's come to the fore in recent years by scholars like Anita Auer in Lausanne and Laura Wright in Cambridge, who've really been looking at the history of English and how English has emerged, not just in terms of the literary evolution of the language, but looking at regional varieties of English and the multilinguistic origins of English. That kind of theory and those kind of ideas haven't been applied much to other languages and hardly at all in Italian. So one way of really looking at the evolution of Italian that I've been investigating recently has been using the concept of overabundance in morphology, or multiple forms occupying the same cell in the verb paradigm. We know a lot about what those paradigms looked like for literary language, but by looking at non-literary forms of language, in particular merchant language or religious language, we can see how, in actual fact, Italian has a huge variety of different forms that occupy the same cell. This is really important because we can see how competition between various linguistic variants lasted for centuries sometimes, and in certain cases no one form ever wins out. That's still a feature of contemporary Italian, that multiple forms are still acceptable in the standard. If we look at non-literary language, we can see how these merchant writers, merchant letters, religious writing contain many different forms, and we can see how those forms interacted with standards and dialects throughout the history of Italian. So that tells us a lot about new and different forms, varieties that emerge in the history of Italian, including different processes behind the emergence of those forms, like supralocalization, urban varieties of language, and koinization. Those forms of dialect contact, sometimes second dialect acquisition, are really important in the history of Italian because they show how even the idea of Italian as being a single language actually has multiple processes behind the formation of emerging standards. That's what my current research is engaged in.